Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another episode from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Today, we are going to talk about orchid problems. They are not actually problems, and you really shouldn't worry about them, even though they might look a little bit concerning. Orchids can sometimes do stuff that look a little weird, might make us a little anxious, so hopefully after today's video, you will recognize what are the problems that you should focus on and which are just normal behavior for orchids. I will be sure to link in the description a video about real orchid problems and how you can address them. In this series, we did make a few videos on proper orchid problems, so check the description down below if you're interested in that. Today's video, just like our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is of course sponsored by repotme.com, which offers you everything you can possibly need to properly take care of your orchid, from potting mixes to pots, fertilizers, accessories, and much more. If you're into African violets, bonsais, or succulents, they do have something for you as well. So I will be sure to link you to their store down below. Feel free to visit them at any time. And I'll also be sure to include my favorite products, some products that I still use to this day and I have been using for years, even before the collaboration with Repotme. So with that said, let us start with, I think, the most frequent problem that I see being asked about in the comment section of my videos. And this is, help, my orchid lost its flowers and now the stem is completely drying out. What do I need to do to save my orchid? And well, my friends, you can be relieved because everything is fine. Just like any other plant, a Phalaenopsis and any other orchid will at some point stop flowering. In order for our beautiful orchids to produce blooms in the first place, they need to grow. This means leaves, roots, stems, or other structures such as pseudobulbs or canes, depending on the orchid. The blooming period actually takes a lot of resources from the orchid. So for an orchid to be in bloom all of the time is not healthy, and it's just not possible. At some point, it has to stop blooming, it has to grow leaves and other structures. Now, for Phalaenopsis orchids, this might be a little bit of a shocker because yes, they can be in bloom for months and months on end, even over 1 year if you count the side shoots that it can produce. So when all of the flowers go away, you might be tempted to be a little scared. Don't be. Everything is absolutely normal. Now starts the active period for this orchid. So I was saying it will start to create new leaves, new roots, new structures, and it will bloom again on a brand new flower spike in the blooming season. Blooming season is usually the cooler seasons. If you don't know what I'm talking about and if you don't know how to rebloom these orchids, check the description below. There's a little bit of a trick and a little bit of a discussion, which I'm not gonna get into now because I have a dedicated video for that. And as for the drying flower spike, well, you can absolutely cut it away. You're not gonna cut anything vital from your orchid. Vital structures are leaves, roots, the crown, all of these things that actually help it survive. And generally speaking, once your orchid enters a rhythm, it will bloom on new flower spikes once a year, and it will have a growing period again once a year. So if you've enjoyed your blooms for a few months and now everything is gone, don't panic. It's supposed to happen. Your orchid is just starting its active phase. The next problem concerns aerial roots, and especially on Phalaenopsis orchids since they produce a lot of aerial roots. Either the roots are dry or slightly shriveled, or the orchid is not producing aerial roots at all. What could be the problem? What should you do about it? And the answer is not a whole lot. You can just not do anything if you so desire. Well, my little doves are very amused by our discussion. Okay, to be frank, there is no such thing as aerial root. We created this term to make it easier for us to explain what we mean and what we're talking about. So aerial roots are these roots that stick out of the pot. While in the pot, we have the normal roots. Well, all of them, they're the same. They're the same type of roots. Phalaenopsis orchids and many other orchids which we can grow in our homes are epiphytic, meaning they don't grow in soils but rather on trees and rocks or anything that is not in the soil. For this reason, all of their roots are actually aerial. So because all of an orchid's roots serve the same function, whether they grow in the air or in the pot, It really doesn't matter. What matters is that most of an orchid's roots benefit from moisture and nutrients. So as long as you have a decent amount of roots inside the pot, the fact that the roots outside of the pot are either a little shrivelly, either dry, either you don't have a lot of them, really doesn't matter. What you need are the potted roots. And this is something that applies in cultivation. It is far more likely for these roots to benefit from nutrients and moisture inside the pot rather than outside the pot. No matter how much we might try to spray them or wet them or things of the sorts, we usually rely on these roots. It is true that in some environments with very low humidity, aerial roots will just not grow as long. Maybe they will stop growing, maybe they will look a little bit shriveled, but all in all, it's not going to impact the orchid if the vast majority of the roots are inside the pot, benefiting from moisture and nutrients. Next, very common problem. My orchid's oldest leaves are yellowing and falling. What am I doing wrong? Is my orchid going to die? And well, the answer is most probably not. Now, we all want our orchids to look beautiful, green, and luscious all of the time. Well, the reality is, nature doesn't really work like that. If you ever go outside in nature and you look at a tree or a bush, if you look at it from afar, you will say it's perfect, everything is a-okay. But the closer you go to it, you will notice that some of the leaves either have blemishes, some of them are a little yellowing. You will find quote-unquote imperfections when it comes to the aesthetic. Well, orchids are no different than any other plant. They will at some point lose some of these structures because nothing lives forever. So what happens with most orchids is that the older structures at some point after many years will just yellow, dry out, and fall off. And this is absolutely fine. Now on Phalaenopsis orchids, the bottommost leaves tend to fall regularly, either one per year or two, or every few years. You will find some of the older leaves just becoming dry and falling off. And that is absolutely fine. It is part of the regenerative process that all orchids go through. Oncidiums will eventually lose some of the oldest pseudobulbs. Dendrobiums, just like oncidiums, after many years, they will lose the oldest canes, and so on. Depending on the orchid, you'll have structures that after they served their purpose, they will just wither off, and that is absolutely fine. Now, what you don't want to have is yellow leaves on top of the orchid. That most likely is crown rot, which is very prevalent in cultivation due to the conditions in which we grow our orchids. The newer the structure, the less likely it is to wither off. So if your orchid is just shedding some old leaves, don't worry about it. Most probably it is absolutely fine. But if it's starting to shed very new structures, that is a sign you should address. But if it's older structures, highly likely it's nothing to worry about. Next problem that I do see quite a lot in the comment section is regarding roots again. The roots of my orchid have just stopped growing. How can I make them start again? And well, the answer is there is no way to jumpstart them because what's happening is absolutely normal. Now, if you know your orchid pretty well, you know that when roots are actively growing, they will have this beautiful green tip, while the rest of the root would be white or silvery. So while you have a green root tip, you know that that root is actively growing and the orchid is healthy. There are instances in which some roots just stop growing. Maybe all of the roots on your orchid will eventually stop growing at some point. What is wrong with your orchid? And well, most likely nothing is wrong. Roots on orchids don't necessarily grow continuously. The orchid allocates energy into whatever it needs to at a certain point. Sometimes it allocates energy more to the leaves than anything else, sometimes more to the flowers. It is very common to have roots completely stop growing, meaning not having that green tip when orchids bloom, because most of the energy goes into blooms. This doesn't mean the roots are going to die or that they're unhealthy. They're actually performing as they should. They're absorbing water and nutrients. They're just not actively growing at that time because the orchid is just focusing on something else. So if your orchid has a very good root system and furthermore it is blooming or it's creating beautiful new leaves, but the roots are just not growing anymore actively, everything is fine. You really shouldn't worry about it. The orchid knows what it's supposed to do. If you're wondering if the roots will start growing once again, yes, they can definitely do so. They can continue growth from that point. Ever saw roots that appear to have some segments? Yeah, sometimes in the past they stopped growing and then they just started again. Sometimes they can branch out, and sometimes brand new roots can form at the same time as older roots start to grow once again. What you have to do is just pay attention to the context and the overall look of your orchid. If everything looks normal and you have a whole bunch of roots, there's nothing to worry about. But if you only have two little roots which are trying to grow and they continuously stop growing, usually that is due to a humidity issue. Inside an orchid pot, we usually have quite a lot of humidity. No matter if the air is dry, we can have a potting mix that retains moisture and humidity in the air pockets, and that favorizes the continuous growth of your roots. If roots continuously stop growing and you're starting to have a pretty dehydrated orchid, that means you have an issue with the watering or humidity levels inside the pot. So you might want to adjust your watering. Maybe you have to water your orchid a little bit more frequent. Remember, most orchids need to be watered when they're dry or almost completely dry. If you leave them dry for 5 days in a row, maybe that's a little too much. Maybe you need to water a little bit more frequent. So just observe the orchid, but if you notice that the roots are fine, the orchid is not dehydrated, furthermore it blooms, there's really nothing to worry about. Structures stop and start to grow depending on season, depending on what the orchid does, and following the natural growth pattern of the orchid. Next problem, my orchid has all sorts of purpley spots on the leaves, particularly on the new leaves. What am I doing wrong? Should I cut the leaf? What am I supposed to do? Well, there are two instances here. I'm gonna refer mostly to the one where you really don't need to worry about it. Purple spots, and generally speaking, a purple tinge, which sometimes you guys ask me about, is absolutely normal for many orchids. It is a natural pigment called anthocyanin, which has many roles, one of them being protecting the orchid from intense light. Now, there are some orchids which are more prone to these purple spots or tinges on the leaves than others. Not all of them will have them, but generally speaking, as long as your orchid has purple or reddish spots, even if it's very dark purple or very dark red like maroon, everything is okay. Furthermore, you can just Google your orchid on the internet and see if other specimens look like that. It might just be that anthocyanin pigment that is triggered by maybe some bright light you are providing to your orchid. Many Cattleya orchids have freckles, I like to call them freckles, but also vandas and higher light orchids in general, since they had to develop a few strategies to make sure they don't burn in the intense light they typically grow in naturally. But sometimes you have some Phalaenopsis with some spotting, particularly if they are descendants of the Phalaenopsis schilleriana, which let me show you my spotted queen. There she be. How beautiful is she? Let me just make some room for her. Now, this orchid is not so spotted to protect itself from bright light. It is a natural pigmentation which to me looks like a sort of camouflage. In this way, it avoids standing out in the forest, so it's not going to be visible to predators. Well, some hybrids that have this orchid in their parentage sometimes do have the spotted gene. Not to the extent of the schilleriana, but just a little bit. As you can see, this particular orchid, oh, she's spotted. If you didn't know this is natural pigmentation, you'd be a little concerned. Well, it's absolutely normal. So many orchids can actually have natural mottling or pigmentation, which is absolutely fine. What you don't want to have is black spots or very dark blackish brown. Those can actually be something else, usually a bacterial or fungal infection. Also, usually they just appear over the course of a few days and they tend to spread. The number one rule with orchids is if it spreads, then you need to take care of it. If it doesn't spread, it's okay, let it be, when it comes to orchid leaves at least. But overall, the things that I just showed you today, all of these are natural freckling. It doesn't mean anything. It's absolutely normal for your orchid to have them, and in some cases you do want these freckles to appear just to signal you that you are providing adequate lighting, particularly for Cattleyas and Vandas and other highlight orchids. And lastly, sticky, watery droplets on the leaves, or rather under the leaves, or on the flower spike, or even on the buds. What are these? Am I having an issue with my orchid? And the answer is, Most probably no. These sticky droplets are actually sap. They're sugary sap that the orchid creates to feed itself. Most of the structures on an orchid have pores because they breathe. Through these pores, the sap can sometimes just ooze through. And this is what you see here. It is more likely to see these droplets on the underside because there are more pores on the underside than the upper side, which is protected by a thicker cuticle. Also, the flower spikes, buds, and even flowers, they don't actually have that cuticle, or if they do, it's a very thin cuticle. So their pores are pretty much open to the air. They will ooze the sap since they are fed pretty vigorously by the orchid. Flower spikes consume a lot of energy and the orchid feeds them intensely. Hence why on many orchids you will see the sap mostly on the flower spike. But as I was saying, the underside of the leaf is prone to having these sticky droplets as well, particularly new leaves. And you will discover with orchids that the newer structures are more prone to having the sticky sap. However, though, it is also true that this sap tends to ooze out a little more if the orchid has some scratches or munches, better said, on the leaves or its structures. And these munches, of course, mean pests. Now, I don't want to alarm you, but if you notice extreme amounts of sap on your orchid, just give it a look, check the undersides, check the crown and the stem, all of these areas which are not so exposed. This is typically where pests reside. And if you see anything abnormal or weird or even grazed patches, then yes, in that case, the sap means you have some pests that munched and created some wounds through which the sap is oozing out. But again, I don't want to alarm you. This sap is very, very normal. It really doesn't mean you have pests 100%, but just give your orchid a look. It's not gonna hurt it. You just need to confirm that you really don't have pests. Other than that, don't worry about it. If it's a little bit annoying and it sticks to your finger or your clothes or things of the sort, some orchids can produce a lot of sap. What you can do is just get yourself a wet cloth or wet paper towel or even some of these cotton buds. Soak it in water very well and then remove it gently so you don't scratch the leaf, and it's gone. Since it's sugar, it's gonna dissolve in water really fast. So that is about it for today. If you have suggestions to add to this list, leave me a comment down below and tell me what used to scare you at the beginning, but then after you learned a little bit more about orchids, they don't scare you anymore. I'm curious to know. These have been, let's say, the top things that stick out to me, but I'm sure there are others. So I hope this video was useful to you. Check the description. I will add more tutorials or more videos that pertain to this subject. If you need more explanations or you want to focus on a particular subject, most probably you'll find something in the description below. So with that said, thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed your time. Thank you RepodMe for sponsoring yet another episode from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!